Well, I would start by saying that we have heard today several different approaches to the main issue. What makes us human? Can we say something about that? And so now maybe I would like to ask the various speakers to say something about what they think they have contributed. Where is Christopher? Yeah, why are you not sitting here? Aha. Yeah. So I would like to ask the speakers what they think that have contributed, they or their colleagues, to answering the main question, which was the question of this meeting. So what do we know after today? What do we know more about the human brain? Christopher.
Well, I mean, we know enormously more, I mean, speaking from the Allen Institute, about specific genes, specific marker genes that are expressed in specific single cell types of the human cortex and how they relate specifically to things in mouse cortex. So that's sort of essential if we want to build therapies that depend on specific genes that are being up or down regulated. We need to understand this not only in model systems but actually in the human. And that now, thanks to high throughput transcriptomics and EFIS and morphology, we can now carry out at large scale. So it's very specific technical knowledge pertaining to differences.
Yeah, I think in my case, what's most important is the realization that if we want to understand cells and synapses of the human brain, we should actually study cells and synapses in the human brain, and not only in the mouse brain. So that's, I think, what our work tries to show is that it is possible, that it requires a lot of interactions with clinicians, with surgeons, which is sometimes really difficult, that hampers good basic research on human tissue. But I think that by doing it, and especially since also Allen Institute is doing it, I think that, that it hopefully inspires other people, because almost every university, every academic hospital has a neurosurgery department and has neurophysiology or anatomy labs, so it should be more prevalent around the world. So let's all start to study the human brain rather than the mouse brain, or in parallel maybe.
Just changing gear a little bit. So what I've learned a lot about description of the brain at a lower level than I study it, but I feel like where the different approaches at different levels are oscillating between either looking for general principles or looking for specializations. And I wonder what the other panel members in the audience think about how can we integrate the different levels of study. So for instance, the different dendritic trees can make a link to a bit higher level neuroscience and to behavior. And I think that that link we haven't seen too much about today. So I don't know if there are people who have thoughts about that.
Wait, Hype tried to show directly.
I think that was the prominent example.
A mental and a biophysical property.
Yeah, I think we need more of that.
So I think what we try to contribute is to more precisely describe differences that we see between the species, but also differences that we see between human brains. That is variability. And variability is an interesting phenomenon, and it's not just a factor like noise that we want to exclude, but we have to study it also to better understand cognitive function and behavior at the end. And the second conclusion for me is that this variability really differs independent on the level that you are addressing. It might be lower on a cellular level than on a systemic level, but I mean, we have to prove it. And it differs also with respect to the modality that you are analyzing. So you have really to answer the question, what are interspecies differences precisely for many aspects. And the question of what makes us human is not so much that we can identify one region or one principle of brain organization. It's also more a quantitative way of approaching this problem, and we are not yet there to extract a rule that helps us really to say that this is perhaps the most important that contributes to interspecies.
Well, I actually think that a lot of what makes us human is not to be found between the ears. but it is how we relate to our environment and how we, somehow what is between our ears allows us to interact with our environment in certain ways and structure it. Things like symbolic representations, the ability to encapsulate knowledge and in artifacts, in language and speech, and then transmit them culturally through generations. I think that without that, we would be in some sense just another animal, as Christoph said. But our ability to structure our environment using our body and our sensory apparatus and our machines and tools ultimately to create artifacts and to transmit information, sort of build, not forget everything that we have done or as a species with every generation, but transmit. I think that's really what creates the opportunity that humans have, and it sets them apart, if anything. I don't think it's so much, a particular brain region or a particular type of neuron or a particular molecule, but somehow yet there is something about our brains that allows us to do that, and what that is, I don't know, but I'm curious to find out.
Thank you. We can light up the philosophical question here. What makes us human is that we try to understand our brain compared to other animals, and then brings the other question, if our brain can understand its own brain. And this is another thing, and it brings up the scaling issue that we have. Do we really need to understand each and every synapse in the brain in order to understand it? And if we look at a neuron, a single neuron on a single cell or a bunch of cells, can we say something about the organ? Because the brain is a whole organ and works as one, not a single neuron, not a single cell. It's a whole organ that works in an orchestral manner to create behavior, to create cognition. And I think the discussion that neuroscientists in general should do is that looking at the single neurons, yes, it will tell us a lot about the cell biology of that single neurons and how neurons react, but will that tell us something about the organ itself?
I think Rich Walsh, I'll dig it to you in a second. I think Rich Walsh just said it yesterday that maybe we will not understand our brain, but computers will understand our brains, and at that point we will not be able to understand computers.
Yeah, so in part I echo Giorgio on this. So I think it maybe comes from the physics community. If our brain, a caution against oversimplification, premature oversimplification. If our brains were as simple as we sometimes discuss them to be, we would not be able to understand them. And this is not a statement of futility or pessimism. We have to go with what we know, we think we know, but at the same time not get locked into dogma. So my conclusion at this, almost the end of the second day, would be we just need to keep up enthusiasm and energy.
Can I make a point about the critical importance of details? There was a review in Nature by Botan Boska last week about visual blindness, and makes this point very beautiful. There are many different forms of retinal blindness. There are many forms of retinal pathology. Each one we now know is due to a specific defect in 1 out of 100 different cell types, right? There are roughly 100 different cell types. They're very conserved across all vertebrates. And in one, for example, a particular type of nystagmus is due to one type of synapse that misses one protein between a starburst amacrine cell and an on-off direction selective ganglion cell. Some of the other form of blindness in each case are due to a very specific deficit that now with AAV and with gene therapy we can start to cure. It is quite likely that if we look at many psychiatric diseases, including, that are multi-gene, including particular schizophrenia, that each different form of schizophrenia may be due to a dysregulation of very specific genes expressed in very specific cell types. So the bad news is, unlike a large-scale non-evolved system like the sun or the weather, these are highly evolved physical systems, and so the details ultimately matter because you get this punch through from a low level of organization all the way to a highest level of organization. So we need both levels, all levels.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this, I tend, can I just continue I'll come to you in a second. I think we can continue to analyze, I agree that we need the details, but what I'm wondering about is here we are coming from communities which are further and further away, in a sense, from the detail of the brain organization. So I'm wondering what each of us feels about the next, say, higher or lower level. What would we expect to hear from the higher or lower level, respective level that we're working at?
I think what you may be thinking, not that I need to respond to it, what I would concur is yes, we need to have respect for the brain, respect for the levels, and try for the communication. And it's hard because everything is pushing us to be more and more professional in what we're doing. So maybe half the week or even 3/4 of the week we do professional, but then there should be some channels for backing off and having tea or a drink, so deliberately talking between the levels. But it's very important to acknowledge the weaknesses and the strengths and the efforts of the other levels.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed all the talks today very much, and I learned a lot from each of them. But I think none of them, for me, have attempted really to answer the question, what makes us human? Because all these differences between species do not tell us anything about what makes us human. To show that there is a difference between a macaque, or several differences between a macaque brain and our consciousness or our human being is a correlation, just like having wings or having a tail tell us about this. So it's not, of course the brain is related to the mind, but it doesn't tell us. The fact that they have these cells or more of this cell, more of this, does not tell us anything about, and the more we learn, the more detail we get from there, will not get us any closer to answer, in my mind, to answer the question, what makes us human? And the answer is, and I think it has been hinted here, is by studying humans. And if we want to, and it's not just that there is a human mind, a brain. Each of us has a different brain. Each of us has a different personality. Each of us is a different, and this is what makes us humans. And to look at us collectively, I think misses the important things. And if we invest much more in trying to understand what is the uniqueness in terms of our operative abilities as humans, and compare this to what we can understand in the human brain now, I think this is the way that I would see can answer the important question of what makes us human.
Very briefly, I think this gets us back to the very beginning when the introduction was, well, all of these abstracts are very powerful, but perhaps they tell us what enables us to be human. And if we ask what is to be human, then you need to incorporate yet other levels. Maybe it comes day 3. So yes, but I think what we were doing is coming from our respective expertise and contributing certain things. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. It's a big hole in how to be.
May I ask you what your background is? Are you a philosopher or anthropologist? Or? Oh, I see. So near to philosophy. I sort of tend to agree that we had in this session not too much neuropathology, neurological or psychiatric pathology. Perhaps some of the neurons that were removed from the epileptic foci were not completely normal. So that is why they were firing so much energetically. And they were integrating, or
the trouble is you don't get access to a healthy, normal brain, live brain tissue. Right? We don't.
I can give a long answer, of course. So we try to quantify as much as we can the influence of the disease on the properties of the neurons by keeping different patient populations apart and seeing whether properties generalize across different types of patients with different disease backgrounds and these things. But of course, we can never get around the question or the point that the tissue came from patients. So this is...
You have two different sources. You have tumors and you have different...
Exactly. So that's what we carefully look at, and yeah.
Yeah, hi. I very much agree and glad that you raised the subject about the need for more multi-scale research. So I have a very general question. Is there any agreement on what not makes us human on any of these scales?
Our liver probably isn't as important.
Not necessarily. Chris? Not if you live in Britain.
Well, I guess I was just trying to do a Gedanken experiment to try to think about how can we define what's, if we want to think of what makes us human experimentally, perhaps we could try to frame the question as what, the way a geneticist might, which is basically what is essential to be human. So is there some experiment we could design where we would take something away from a human and we would no longer consider them to be a human, whether that might be a lesion to a part of the brain, removing a structure, or whether that might be removing a gene, you know. And so is there some state of people where we might imagine that they have lost, you know, or we might categorize them as having lost something that we think of as essentially human, because if there is something that makes us human, then you know, there should be such a state. For example, if there's a gene that makes us human, the way I think of it is there ought to be somebody with a mutation in that gene, because there are people with mutations in every gene and every locus, every part of every gene. So I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, there are few babies born with a birth tube defect, right, in the first trimester, so-called anencephalic. So they have no cortex. I don't know, are they not human anymore? If you ask the parents, it certainly insists that their children are human, although they won't see and hear, and they'll never be able to talk. So I think that's a very difficult question that more relates to legal issues, social issues, cultural issues, and ultimately metaphysical issues.
Here.
I think the question, what makes us humans, is so philosophical that to try to answer it with empirical, scientific ways is very, very problematic. The question, what makes us humans? Our parents are humans. This is why we are humans. This is it. To take a human and to make it another species is impossible. We are human because we are human. That's it. It's a circular question. It's a circular answer, but this is it.
You have to defend yourself.
Yeah, I mean, Yedan obviously wanted to give us a title where we have to think about, and indeed it's more philosophical. So I would not expect that taking away one mechanism, one gene, and of course also not one brain region helps us. When babies are born, they have probably less capacities as an adult gorilla has, yeah, in many. So, I mean, if you just have a cross-sectional view, this does not help to answer the question, and in my view we should rather try to locate, so to say, the human being in this whole evolutionary line, which has many different niches for many animals, which have their specialization, and I'm less in favor of this more anthropocentric view that the human brain is, so to say, the upper point of everything. So in that sense, I think we should put ourselves more into this evolutionary line, and my understanding is the more we are going also into comparative anatomy and learn more about what macaques are thinking, how they are acting. We learn more about social behavior of gorillas, for instance. I think we will be much more surprised, even more surprised in the next years, how human-like animals can be in many respects. And again, in my view, it's more a question of gradation and not so much so what makes us human. So this I would probably answer more on a genetic point of view, but this is not the interesting answer, in my view.
May I have the last common question? Yes, and say that I felt here that the discussion is really reflecting what we are, humans. We don't agree about anything, and we... So this is what makes us human. But seriously, I think that the approach that Christoph here may be best described as we need to know all the details, and the approach that we will never understand the brain, even if we know all the details, are not so far from each other. The one thing that links and was missing in the discussion, I think, was the general theory. Namely, it's not that we can do experiment and rule out all the other things. There is no hypothesis, and I'm in brain science for 50 years or so, there is no hypothesis that I heard that I can refute by any experiments that we do on a large scale. I mean, on real solid basis. So we need theories about the brain, and we need to investigate it in all the ways that you just described, that we here just described, because there is a place for everything. And as you said, you know, it's a lot of work. So you do your work and measure each of the cells in the brain, and then you do your work and study each of synapse, how is it different in humans and animals, etc. But if we don't have a theory, this will not work. This leads to nowhere. So we need to work with some theory in mind, what makes us different. And I think that one of the main things that we all agree is that we have highly creative imagination as humans, and because of that, Vered can sit here with this device, yes, and the gorilla cannot do this. And that is the main difference. And how do we come to this creativity that imagine things and invent them? This is the question that we have to ask on a theoretical level.
Yeah, there was this sort of Gedanken experiment of the Chinese room. You remember that one? You are in front of a room, and inside the room there is a being which is either a human or a computer. And by asking questions to this being, you will eventually understand whether it is a human or a computer. I frankly don't remember which kind of questions you had to ask, but it is not true anymore? It is done, and well, oh, I see, I'm sorry, I am behind. Yeah. That is why Markram tomorrow will say that, yeah, okay.